Today we're going to be focusing on EPA's Lead Action Plan Research Update. EPA research supports actions to reduce lead exposures and related health risk as part of the federal action plan to reduce childhood lead exposures and associated health impacts. If you have a question during or after the presentation today, please type it into the Q&A pod at any time. And once the presentation ends, we will answer as many questions as time allows. The slides from today will be made available on the EPA research website, and we will type that address into the chat pod, and we will follow that with a recording of today's presentation. Really happy to welcome Dr. Andrew Geller, our presenter today. Andrew is ORD's lead, executive lead for our lead research and also the Principal Associate National Program Director for EPA ORD's Sustainable and Healthy Communities Research Program. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you all for joining me today. It's an honor to be giving this discussion. You know, it's every parent's nightmare learning that his or her child has elevated blood lead level and wondering what effects this will have on the rest of their life. I'm here to talk to you about EPA's Office of Research and Development efforts in research, technical assistance, and tools that support the agency's and the state's efforts to prevent lead exposure. As Lisa told you, this EPA's efforts are part of the Federal Lead Action Plan. In fact, the Federal Lead Action Plan was devised and led by EPA, HUD, DHHS, and CDC, together with 17 other federal agencies, recognizing the importance of dealing with this legacy issue. Today, I'm going to emphasize the work that ORD is doing in the Federal Action Plan Goal 4, support and conduct critical research to inform efforts to reduce lead exposures and related health risks. So our the current landscape, EPA is taking action on lead. EPA has updated or is in the process of updating rules under TSCA, FDWA, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and CERCLA, and it's providing significant resources for updating drinking water infrastructure through the WIN Act to reduce exposure to lead. ORD research supports the agency's rulemaking and actions to reduce lead exposure from multiple environmental media. The breadth of regulation that we see here really reflects and reminds us that lead is a multimedia problem, potentially present in soil, dust, water, air, food, and commercial products. Now, many talks in this series have dealt with emerging environmental conditions and contaminants like the perfluorinated compounds. Move that back here. In some ways, lead is the opposite of PFAS. It's included in at least 12 federal regulations and in many more rules under these regulations. Many of the sources of lead are well characterized. Gaps remain, however, in developing accurate national and state level elevated blood lead and exposure maps, identifying remaining local exposure sources and exposure routes, and rapid identification of lead service lines, interactions of drinking water chemistry, corrosion control compounds, and lead pipe scale and lead in piping and pipe fixtures. We know that lead is a potent developmental and adult toxicant. Regulation of lead since the 1970s has resulted in steep drops in population blood lead levels. CDC's current reference level of 5 microgram per deciliter is defined as that level that warrants public health action and it's based on some of our population estimates of blood lead level. Now, many of you have joined EPA for these tools and resources webinars, and so I'm going to bring you into EPA and Office of Research and Development to recognize that lead is a cross-cutting research issue. It has a home in multiple of ORD's research programs, the Health and Environmental Risk Assessment Program, our Safe and Sustainable Water Resources Program, and our Sustainable and Healthy Communities Research Program. It's also the topic of many projects under our Regional Applied Research Efforts, or RARE, and our Superfund Technical Liaison research projects. I'll summarize our research focus, and then we'll go into a little bit more depth. As I said at the outset, ORD has provided direct scientific support of updated rules under TSCA and CIDWA in 2019, and is updating and has updated blood lead models used for site-specific determinations. ORD is aiding in the implementation of CERCLA by making soil tests less expensive and more rapid, and developing innovative methods to mitigate exposure at contaminated sites by reducing bioavailability. We're working with EPA's regions and states to identify and target potential lead exposure sources in communities with children with elevated blood lead levels. And we're working to improve drinking water quality across the United States by developing methods to identify lead service lines and evaluating corrosion control treatments and providing technical support to mitigate lead issues in water distribution systems. So here, let me summarize some of our key research products. When you go to these slides, which Lisa will make available after this presentation, you can visit these links to see more detail. So this year, we've worked to update and evaluate regulatory and site cleanup models of blood lead levels. That includes the Integrated Exposure Uptake Biokinetic Model, or IEUBK Model 2.0, and the All Ages Lead Model. For the IEUBK model, we've just completed a peer-reviewed evaluation of that updated model using updated parameters to better predict blood lead models in children under different conditions. For the All Ages Lead Model, we've the agency Science Advisory Board reviewed that model, and ORD is now actively responding to that review, updating the All Ages Lead Model. The AALN, as we call it, can be used to estimate blood lead levels in people from ages 2 to 90. It can also be used to evaluate the impacts of periodic lead exposure versus just chronic lead exposure. We've also made some pioneering steps in linking these, our exposure models, our internal lead models, with exposure models, our stochastic models, our stochastic human exposure and dose simulator. This work was used in the updated dust lead hazard standards and the lead and copper rule. And more details of this are available through these publications. In addition, we are pioneering new methods to target lead exposure and map locations of high potential lead exposure and key drivers in those locations. In specific media, we're looking at water systems and home drinking water safety. Again, looking at water sampling methods to evaluate drinking water lead exposure and identified lead service lines. Doing corrosion control research, looking at water chemistry, scale analysis, and premise plumbing. This is an area where we also provide states, the regions, states, and municipalities with technical assistance. evaluation and tools to improve point-of-use water filtration methods, and as I said, technical support. We also know that soil and dust are critical exposure sources for lead, and we are working with the Department of Housing and Urban Development to analyze their samples from the American Healthy Home Surveys, looking at dust, oil, and water from homes in a probabilistic sample across the United States. And finally, we've just kicked off the integrated science assessment for lead under the lead NAAQS, lead National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So let me go into a little bit more depth, providing you with some examples of some of our research. So let's start off with determining lead exposure in homes. Here we start with the problem of needing better estimates of lead in drinking water for estimating exposures. You know, current sampling of household water is really focused on looking at corrosion control methods rather than looking at what people are really exposed to in their daily use of drinking water. This research is to design sampling techniques to measure drinking water lead in premise plumbing, that is in household plumbing, and update some of our models used for complex premise plumbing arrangements. We have developed an extension of the EPA NET model, the publicly usable model to model fate and transport of lead in premise plumbing. The impact of this research and our recommendations on improved sampling techniques that can inform health and regulatory efforts. We're also working to identify lead service lines. In the updated lead and copper rule that may be finalized even this month, identifying and replacing lead service lines is one of all of our top priorities. The problem is that 3 to 6 million American homes and businesses are still connected to water systems through lead supply lines, but their locations remain unknown in many communities. We need an updated sampling protocol to identify where these are located. So our approach is to develop updated identification methods. Our primary research is looking at sequential water tap sampling profiles. We're also developing a patent-pending lead exposure assessment device to identify lead service lines. The impact of this research, again, to inform lead and copper rule sampling approaches, to provide cheaper, less invasive, and more accurate ways of identifying lead service lines, and to develop, if possible, a patent-pending faucet-mounted point-of-use filter device to detect lead service lines, to make it easy to detect those lead service lines and estimate exposure in homes, all with the goal of accelerating and facilitating replacement of those lead service lines. Part of the issue in drinking water is really understanding where there are existing lead service lines, where there may be lead in pipe fixtures or lead stores in galvanized pipes. We need to understand under what conditions that lead is released from lead pipes. For this, we've got a laboratory that does lead pipe scale analysis. I love this research. It's my science head says microstratigraphy, looking at the layers inside of pipes that show where the lead is deposited and where there are protective layers that make that lead insoluble. So we've got a laboratory that specializes in evaluating the state of corrosion control treatment in pipes. We're working to predict impacts of changes to corrosion control additions to municipal drinking water or other water treatment processes, and providing a practical evaluation of those corrosion control approaches used in different locations. This is one area where the Office of Research and Development experts provide technical support to communities and states across the United States. We work with the Office of Water on corrosion control training, and we're working to improve understanding of the impacts of water quality and corrosion control on the stability of the lead scales that are inside those pipes. When there is a lead problem in some locations, there have been recommendations to use point-of-use filter devices to help to reduce the lead in the drinking water. There have been a few cases where lead bypasses the filter. ORD has been called in by regions, states, and cities to evaluate the situation, to diagnose what might be happening, and to ultimately determine treatment effectiveness for different forms of lead and devise methods to ultimately filter that lead out. This has been really innovative research identifying conditions under which nanoparticles of lead are produced. And unfortunately, many of our current point-of-use devices are not designed for those to filter out those lead nanoparticles. One of ORD's advancements has actually been devising methods to produce standardizable lead nanoparticles so that manufacturers of point-of-use devices can then move forward in updating their designs to filter these devices, to filter these particles out. So this research can help and is helping the National Sanitation Foundation in their efforts to set treatment standards for point-of-use devices. And finally, as I've mentioned throughout, technical support to reduce lead in drinking water. There is limited technical expertise regarding corrosion control and lead and copper rule exceedances. The actions that ORD experts have been called upon to help with are to review and make recommendations on corrosion control plans, diagnose distribution systems, to perform scale analyses, to review sampling data and reports, and to analyze conditions related to point-of-use filtration. This is just a few of the many, many locations where we've given technical support either briefly or on a continuing basis. We've been working with Providence, Rhode Island and EPA's Region 1 on innovative use of orthophosphate, essentially helping them to optimize and fine-tune their corrosion control methodologies. Sebring, Ohio, Newark, New Jersey, University Park, Illinois, and other locations. I introduced this topic of earlier, innovative multimedia exposure and dose modeling. Here's where we start thinking about the many, many sources of lead in our environment. And how can we estimate blood levels for children of different ages resulting from exposure through drinking water, soil, dust, air, and food? How can we make estimates of the effect on blood lead levels if we, for example, take lead out of the drinking water? How much of a problem is there left yet to solve? Our approach has been to update model parameters and the functional capacity, the graphical user interface, and the ease of use of these models, and to evaluate the model blood lead estimates against real-world data. Again, we've got the all-ages lead model, recently reviewed by EPA's Science Advisory Board and currently being revised, and the IEUBK 2.0 model that has just gone through a peer review in its with updated parameters that is available to the public. These publications are out there on this exposure and dose linked models that were used to help EPA in devising its lead and copper rule and lead dust hazard rule, quantifying relative exposure pathway contributions across population distributions. The next area is one that's really approaching the lead issue from a general problem. How do we identify those areas where there are high lead exposure sites? And how do we identify the key factors leading to that high lead exposure? The problem, while average childhood blood lead levels have dropped across America, children in some communities remain at risk of elevated lead exposure. We know that different states, different localities have different quality of data in terms of blood lead surveillance. Yet we still, and we don't have national exposure risk maps. So ORD is working to develop science-based approaches for identifying those communities with high exposure potential and the key sources of exposure in those communities. So we're using spatial analysis and other statistical or mathematical models to analyze available blood lead level data and census tract scale environmental factors. This is a collaboration with states and other federal agencies with the goal of informing joint EPA and state planning for lead exposure reduction actions. The kinds of information that comes out of this kind of analysis, for example, in a state that has fairly dense and high quality blood lead level surveillance data, we can look at those communities where there is a higher prevalence of elevated blood lead levels. We can also look at the existence, for example, of old housing in those locations, because we know that old housing is one of the main sources of environmental lead due to lead paint and lead in the soil surrounding those houses. One of the interesting questions that we are working with our agency partners to solve is, what about those locations where there's elevated blood lead levels, but old housing does not seem to be the problem? What are the sources of lead in those locations? What is the additional data we need to identify those sources so that, of course, we can move forward to mitigate that exposure? And finally, we move toward Superfund and innovative soil testing methods, saving cleanup costs at Superfund sites across the United States. We know that lead is a big problem in many, many Superfund sites and in urban soils across the United States. Estimating site-specific lead bioaccessibility is a critical factor in setting cleanup levels and determining the cost of cleanup. And up till now, established methods for estimating lead bioaccessibility have been very expensive and very time-consuming. So ORD and the Office of Land and Emergency Management have collaborated to develop reliable and inexpensive rodent and in vitro methods for assessing lead bioaccessibility in contaminated soils. Doing this allows more dense sampling to look for variation across a site, and allows one to save much money in setting site-specific cleanup levels. Finally, in those sites where there is lead, most remediation is based on soil removal and replacement. These are expensive and complex procedures. ORD is working to try to develop methods for in situ lead remediation to mitigate the impacts of ingested soil. So in many communities have already worked on addition of soil amendments, for example, phosphate to reduce the bioavailability of lead. Lead forms insoluble complexes, mineral complexes with that phosphate. This reduces the bioavailability by reducing the solubility of lead. We discovered a novel mineral complex called plumboyarosite, and ORD is now working to evaluate the feasibility of forming plumboyarosite in situ as another method of mitigating the impacts of ingested soil in situ. The result of this would be that soil amendments and other methods would significantly reduce lead bioavailability. As EPA goes forward in developing its strategies for soil lead cleanup and residential soil lead cleanup, these soil amendments may find a place in helping to reduce the cost of those cleanups by binding the lead that remains in those sites and reducing and essentially taking away the risk of the lead that still remains in the site. So once again, in situ lead remediation can potentially reduce the cost of cleanup by mitigating the impacts of ingestion of lead-contaminated soil. This may be a valuable tool to reduce lead exposure. And finally, the integrated science assessment for lead. Lead is one of the National Air Quality Criteria, or NAAQS, standards. Every few years, ORD is responsible for developing the integrated science assessment for the NAAQS, and we have just initiated the update of the lead NAAQS this summer with a posting in the Federal Register. The 2013 lead NAAQS remains one of the nation's primary syntheses of health and exposure information on lead, a systematic review of over 1,500 health and 700 ecological effects studies by ORD. When I have looked at EPA's updated regulations, almost every regulation cites the lead ISA or lead NAAQS because it is such a synthesis, particularly of lead health effects. Finally, just a brief summary. Some of the, in addition to the work going on in ORD's laboratories, ORD's regions have initiated a number of lead projects. Again, they are working, Region 5 area is working on lead service line identification with ORD. Region 10 working on soil amendments, including biochars to reduce the bioavailability of toxic metals and contaminated soils and settlements. And then looking at the long-term fate and evaluation of lead in phosphate-treated waste materials. So earlier I talked about phosphate treatments being a way to make lead insoluble. Well, can we test those with the TCLP procedures to make sure that these lead mineral complexes can be disposed of in solid waste landfills? With that, let me finish up just this brief walkthrough ORD's research program that supports the agency and supports EPA's regions and the states in their lead mitigation efforts. My name is Andrew Geller, once again. At this link, you'll find updates of ORD's lead research and links to recently published research. Thank you very, very much.